London, 1831. Fog curled along the cobblestones like restless spirits, dimming the glow of the gas lamps and softening the edges of the grand townhouses that guarded Grosvenor Square. Inside Harcourt House, where chandeliers blazed with a determined brilliance meant to impress visiting aristocrats, Lady Eliza Harcourt moved like a quiet thought trapped inside a storm. The music from the ballroom swelled in elegant waves, yet each note seemed to anchor her more firmly to the life she had not chosen. Her guardians, Lord and Lady Wintham, had spent the evening parading her before potential allies, whispering her future as though she were absent. But she heard everything, every murmur about the alliance, every speculative remark about Lord Peregrine Rookwood, and every reminder that duty eclipsed desire. Her smile, practiced as any performer's, faltered only when she slipped near the terrace doors, hoping the night air might grant her a moment of truth. The ballroom behind her glittered with silk, jewels, and gilded expectations, yet she could feel the tension coiling beneath her ribcage. She stepped onto the terrace, where cool wind brushed her flushed face, and tried to steady her breath. In the garden below, branches scraped softly against the stone walls, creating a sound like a whispered warning. She leaned on the balustrade, letting the cold smoothness seep into her palms. The stars were hidden behind clouds, as though even the heavens wished to spare her from witnessing her own unfolding fate. She thought of the impending union, a marriage of strategy, not affection, and the loss of her name, her voice, perhaps even her spirit. Her guardians believed themselves benevolent. They spoke of security, status, and propriety, all the while overlooking the quietly burning will of the young woman who bore their family title. Tonight she was expected to play the part of a grateful bride-to-be, but beneath her calm expression, Eliza felt the first true stirrings of rebellion. The doors behind her hissed open, and two ladies, half hidden by their feathered fans, stepped onto the terrace. Eliza stiffened but could not retreat without drawing attention. She listened as they spoke, their voices bright with interest and sharpened with judgment. One remarked that the Harcourts were fortunate to secure any match at all after their financial missteps. The other observed that Lord Rookwood's reputation was notoriously icy, but that such severity might be precisely what Eliza needed. The words struck Eliza like a slap, not for their cruelty but for their certainty. They spoke as though she were already a cautionary tale, a woman destined to be defined by circumstances she did not command. The ladies drifted away with murmurs of amusement, unaware of the wound they had deepened. Alone again, Eliza pressed a trembling hand to her sternum and willed back the rising heat behind her eyes. Shame was a heavy garment, but she refused to wear it willingly. From the terrace she could see the arrival courtyard, where horses stamped impatiently beneath lantern light. A line of carriages waited for their passengers, each one a vessel leading its occupants toward new engagements, new obligations, new days. Eliza's gaze lingered on a dark carriage trimmed in polished brass, its windows shuttered. She did not recognize its crest, and yet something about the vehicle called to her, a silent offer of escape amid the noise of her collapsing future. She tore her gaze away as the ballroom doors opened again and her guardians approached, their expressions filled with the satisfied glow of accomplished manipulation. Lady Wintham took her arm with a grip that conveyed both affection and authority, guiding her back into the swirl of music and expectation. Rookwood would arrive soon, they said. She must be ready to greet him. She nodded, though her blood chilled at the thought. Her life was narrowing to a single path, and with every passing minute the walls closed in further. When Lord Peregrine Rookwood finally entered, the air shifted. A ripple of whispers followed him as he strode across the room with a precision that bordered on predatory. His dark attire contrasted sharply with the brightness of the ballroom, lending him an air of controlled severity. He bowed over Eliza's hand with mechanical courtesy, his eyes assessing rather than admiring. The formal conversation that followed revealed everything she feared. He spoke of alliances, of political advancements, of how her obedience would ensure a smooth union. Not once did he inquire about her wishes. With each measured word, Eliza felt her breath thinning. She realized that if she allowed this marriage to proceed, she would lose the last fragments of herself that still felt alive. His voice faded into the background as she imagined the stifling years ahead, overshadowed by a man who viewed her as an investment rather than a partner. A crack of thunder startled the guests, causing several to glance toward the tall windows where rain had begun to fall in silver lines. The storm outside felt like an omen, or perhaps a summons. Eliza excused herself as politely as she could and stepped away before her guardians noticed. She navigated the corridors with urgency hidden beneath practiced grace, her slippers whispering across marble floors. When she reached the service hallway, her heart pounded with a clarity that felt dangerously liberating. She recalled hearing earlier that a merchant's coach would depart near dawn from the rear courtyard. If she could slip away unnoticed, she might purchase herself a few hours, perhaps even a different fate. She stood still for a moment, letting the storm's rumble steady her resolve. She could no longer rely on anyone else to protect her dignity. She would have to seize it herself. Under cover of rain, Eliza slipped through a side door and into the dim courtyard. Carriages cast long, distorted shadows across the slick stones, each lantern flickering like a wavering promise. She moved toward what she believed to be the merchant's carriage, her cloak gathered tightly around her. A startled groom passed nearby, but the downpour masked her presence, granting her a small mercy. She reached the brass-trimmed vehicle she had noticed earlier, its steps wet and glistening. It looked grander than she expected, but urgency pressed her forward. She opened the door as quietly as possible, then climbed inside, lowering herself behind a stack of travel trunks. The scent of leather, cedar, and faint cigar smoke enveloped her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she felt, for the first time in months, a glimmer of fragile hope. She arranged the blankets over herself, barely daring to breathe. The rain beat steadily on the roof, cloaking any faint rustle she made. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion tug at her thoughts. The decision she had just made was reckless, dangerous, and irreversible, yet it felt more honest than anything she had done under her guardian's guidance. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine what freedom might mean, a life not prescribed by political need or financial desperation but shaped by her own quiet courage. She did not know where the carriage would take her, only that it would be away from the life that sought to claim her without consent. The final lantern in the courtyard flickered as a gust of wind swept through, rattling the windows of Harcourt House. Inside the carriage, Eliza curled deeper into her hiding place. Unaware that the vehicle she had chosen did not belong to any merchant. It belonged to a man whose influence reached far beyond London's social circles, a man whose unexpected involvement would alter every thread of her future. And as the storm intensified, the great horses stamped, the coachman called out, and the carriage jolted into motion, carrying her toward a destiny she could never have imagined. The carriage lurched along the rain-soaked road, its wheels carving dark grooves through the mud as dawn strained against a sky still heavy with storm clouds. Inside, Lady Eliza Harcourt stirred from a shallow, restless doze. A stiff ache pulsed in her limbs, the natural consequence of sleeping in cramped secrecy behind travel trunks, yet a deeper anxiety tightened her chest. She had escaped the ballroom, escaped Rookwood, escaped her guardian's tightening grip, but she had no certainty of where she was being taken. The movement of the carriage grew smoother as it left London's cobbled outskirts, and the muffled hoofbeats suggested a team far finer than any merchant might own. That thought unsettled her, but she forced herself to remain quiet, pressing a hand to her mouth to still her breath whenever the carriage slowed. She reasoned that any risk beyond the city was preferable to returning to the life she had fled. She whispered a trembling promise to herself. She would endure whatever awaited. The carriage came to a halt some time later, accompanied by the muffled exchange of voices. Eliza tensed, clutching the blanket tighter as footsteps approached. The door swung open, letting in a burst of brisk morning air and a silhouette that blocked the rising light. A man stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a controlled motion. His presence filled the narrow space with an air of authority that felt almost tangible. He settled into the opposite seat, removed his gloves, and leaned back as though preparing for a long journey. For a brief moment she dared to believe he had not noticed her. Then his voice, low and cultivated, drifted toward her hiding place. "Come out, if you please. I assure you I have no intention of dragging you out by force." Eliza's breath hitched. She remained still, praying he might mistake her silence for absence. He waited, then spoke again, more gently. "Your fear reveals you more clearly than your attempt at concealment. You are not in any danger from me." There was something in the cadence of his speech, steady, refined, carrying unspoken patience, that convinced her resistance was futile. She pushed the blankets aside, rising slowly from her cramped corner until her eyes met his fully. The man regarded her not with alarm or displeasure but with a measured curiosity. His attire, impeccably tailored and subtly adorned, confirmed her worst realization: this was no merchant. He studied her with an expression that conveyed both recognition and restraint. "Lady Eliza Harcourt," he said softly, as if confirming a theory rather than stating a fact. "You have chosen a most unconventional method of travel." Her cheeks flushed with mortification. She bowed her head, wishing she could vanish into the upholstery. "I did not intend to intrude," she murmured. "I believed this carriage belonged to someone else." The man inclined his head slightly. "Evidently. Though I suspect necessity, rather than mischief, guided your decision." Before she could attempt an explanation, he continued with the crisp clarity of someone accustomed to solving delicate situations. "My name is Alexander Blackwell." The name struck her with the force of a physical blow. Alexander Blackwell, the Duke of Ashmore. A man whispered about in London drawing-rooms with a mixture of awe and speculation. A statesman, a war strategist, a figure who navigated political storms with enviable composure. She stared at him, stunned by the enormity of her mistake. "Your Grace," she breathed, her voice nearly breaking, "if you wish to deliver me back to my guardians, I will not fight. I only ask that you do not send me to Lord Rookwood." Her words hung between them, stark and vulnerable. Something in the Duke's expression shifted, an almost imperceptible softening. "I have no desire to return you to a man who would wield authority without regard for your wishes," he replied. "Tell me truthfully, why did you flee?" Eliza hesitated, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet invitation to speak. She drew a steady breath. "My guardians arranged a marriage without asking my consent. Lord Rookwood views affection as an irrelevant luxury. I fear that if I marry him, I shall disappear entirely." The Duke listened with an attentiveness that felt disarming. "I am familiar with men of his temperament," he said. "They often confuse obedience with harmony." He shifted slightly forward, his tone lowering. "You will remain under my protection for the time being. No one here will force your return." Relief washed over her so suddenly that she nearly swayed. She managed a faint nod, though tears threatened to rise. The Duke offered her a folded cloak resting beside him. "Take this. The morning is still cold, and you must be exhausted." She accepted it with trembling hands, the fabric heavy with warmth and a courtesy she had not expected. The carriage resumed its journey, jolting softly as it turned onto a smoother country road. Eliza wrapped herself in the Duke's cloak, inhaling the faint scent of cedar and smoke embedded within the wool. She sat across from him, attempting to compose herself. Though silence stretched between them, it felt neither harsh nor awkward. Rather, it became a space in which her frantic thoughts settled into clarity. Occasionally she caught him studying her with a thoughtful intensity, as though evaluating not her worth but her circumstances. She wondered why he had been traveling alone, why his expression carried a shadow of fatigue, and what inner battles he might conceal beneath such refined composure. Yet she sensed instinctively that his privacy was not hers to probe. Hours later, the carriage marked its arrival with a smooth roll across gravel. Eliza glanced through the window and caught her breath. Before them rose Ashmore Manor, an expansive estate surrounded by sweeping fields and draped in morning mist. The building, though grand, lacked the ostentation of London palaces. Instead it radiated an air of quiet dignity, a reflection, she realized, of the man who owned it. The Duke stepped out first and offered his hand to assist her. She took it cautiously, her fingers barely grazing his. "You will be safe here," he said. "For now, you shall be known as Miss Ellis. My household is loyal, and discretion is a skill they practice well." She followed him through the entrance hall, where polished floors reflected the subdued light filtering through tall windows. The servants greeted the Duke with respect tinged with curiosity at the unfamiliar young woman accompanying him, yet they asked no questions. Eliza felt a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability as she was led to a chamber overlooking a quiet garden veiled in early spring blooms. "Rest," the Duke advised. "We will speak further when you have regained your strength." She thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper. As he withdrew, she sensed a promise woven subtly into his words, one she did not yet dare to trust. Left alone, Eliza gazed out at the tranquil grounds, her mind struggling to grasp the rapid shift from captivity to sanctuary. She had no assurance of what awaited her beyond this refuge, but instinct told her that the Duke of Ashmore was a man governed not by vanity or ambition but by principle. She sank onto the embroidered coverlet, exhaustion settling into her bones, and allowed herself to believe, if only for a fragile moment, that perhaps she had not leapt into ruin after all. The uncertainty of her future remained vast, but for the first time since fleeing London, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. The Duke of Ashmore departed for London the following morning, leaving Ashmore Manor wrapped in a hush that unsettled and comforted Eliza in equal measure. His absence amplified every small sound, the distant clatter in the kitchens, the muted sweep of servants' footsteps, the rustle of early spring leaves outside her window. She wandered the estate with cautious steps, uncertain whether she was an honored guest or a temporary charge. Yet the staff treated her with a warmth that suggested the Duke had spoken clearly on her behalf, and this quiet acceptance eased her restless thoughts. Still, without his steady presence, the magnitude of her escape pressed down upon her. She could not shake the fear that at any moment a messenger might appear, bearing orders to return her to Rookwood's unyielding grasp. To distract herself from such anxieties, she spent long hours exploring the garden paths. The grounds, though vast, possessed an intimacy that soothed her unease. Early blossoms clung to the hedgerows, their pale petals trembling in the wind like fragile promises. She traced each trail until she reached a secluded corner where a stone bench sat beneath towering elms. Here, she opened the book of poetry the Duke had given her, clearly chosen with consideration, though he had offered it with effortless nonchalance. She read slowly, absorbing the gentle rhythms of the verses, allowing the words to settle her spirit. In the days since her arrival, she found herself returning to this spot often, as though it granted her permission to exist without judgment. Yet no measure of tranquility could fully silence the persistent question echoing within her. What would become of her when the Duke returned? Was she merely a temporary burden, a complication he had taken on out of moral obligation? Or had his compassion been born of something deeper, something unspoken yet unmistakable in the way he listened to her? She tried to banish such thoughts, believing them fanciful, but they crept back whenever she recalled the gentleness in his eyes when he offered her his cloak, or the measured care in his voice when he promised she would not be forced back into a life she feared. Late one evening, after 3 days of quiet uncertainty, she sat by the library hearth, watching the fire flicker across the spines of countless leather-bound volumes. The storm that had carried her away from London had long since passed, and only a soft drizzle remained, tapping against the tall windows like a restless visitor. She wondered whether the Duke faced interrogations or accusations in her absence. She wondered whether her guardians had discovered she fled. The thought of their distress tightened her throat, though she knew they valued reputation more than her well-being. Her fingers traced the edges of the poetry book, seeking reassurance in its familiar texture. A sudden thud echoed from the entrance hall, followed by hurried footsteps. Eliza rose, heart pounding. She moved toward the library doorway just as a servant appeared, startled to find her awake. "Miss Ellis," he said with a respectful bow, "the Duke has returned." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and followed him toward the great hall. The air seemed to pulse with anticipation, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and hoarse sweat. When she entered the hall, she saw the Duke standing near the staircase, rain-soaked and weary, his hair mussed by wind and travel. He looked up at her, and exhaustion softened into something warmer, something unmistakably relieved. "Lady Miss Ellis," he corrected himself gently, "I had hoped you would still be awake." She approached, her steps measured, unsure whether she should bow, curtsy, or simply stand before him. He spared her from choosing by offering a faint smile. "London is preoccupied with other matters," he said. "Your absence has not yet pointed back to this house." She released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I feared you might face consequences on my behalf," she said. "I would not have wished that." The Duke removed his gloves with deliberate slowness, as though preparing himself for a conversation he knew must be handled with care. "Consequences are inevitable for those who choose principle over convenience," he replied, "but I do not shrink from them." He stepped closer, though still maintaining the respectful distance he always kept. "Tell me," he said quietly, "have you found any measure of peace here?" She hesitated, unsure how much truth to reveal. At last she lifted her gaze. "More peace than I ever found in London," she admitted, "though I cannot avoid the fear that it is fleeting." The Duke's expression shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening of concern. "I intend no fleeting protection," he said. "I have taken steps to challenge your arranged union. It may take time, but I believe the contract can be dissolved." Her breath caught. "You would do that? Even if it burdens your name?" His answer came without hesitation. "Your freedom is worth defending." The library beckoned behind her like a sanctuary, and she stepped back, leading him toward the fire's warmth. He followed, his movements slower than usual, the fatigue of travel evident in his posture. When they reached the hearth, the glow cast a soft light across his features, illuminating the strain etched near his eyes. She gestured toward a chair, but he remained standing, as though the weight of their conversation demanded solemnity. "Your guardians," he began, "claim ignorance of your whereabouts. Rookwood, however, is less willing to accept uncertainty. He searches with an intensity that borders on obsession." A shiver passed through her. "He will not find you here," the Duke added, his tone firm enough to anchor her trembling thoughts. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but laden with truths that hovered unspoken. At last he broke it. "When I left for London, I wondered whether you might regret your decision to flee." She stepped closer to the fire, letting its warmth brace her. "I regret only that fear drove me more than courage," she said. "But I do not regret leaving." His gaze softened, a rare crack appearing in his carefully maintained composure. "Fear can be honorable when it shields us from harm," he said. "What matters is that you acted." Their eyes met in the fragile quiet of the moment, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgment of shared understanding, of burdens neither had wished for but both now carried. Before she could respond, the rain outside intensified, drumming insistently against the window-panes. The Duke glanced toward the sound, then returned his attention to her with renewed calm. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we will consider the next steps together." She curtsied, not out of obligation but gratitude, and watched as he turned toward the staircase, his shoulders heavy yet resolute. When he disappeared around the landing, Eliza remained beside the fire, her heart steadier than it had been in days. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risk and the ever-looming shadow of discovery, yet she no longer faced it alone. The Duke had returned, not merely to shield her, but to stand beside her. And that quiet truth settled into her soul like the first fragile spark of hope. Dawn crept slowly over Ashmore Manor the next morning, casting pale gold across the gardens where Eliza stood wrapped in a shawl. She had slept little, her mind replaying the Duke's words with an intensity that unsettled and comforted her in equal measure. The promise of next steps lingered in her thoughts like the distant toll of a bell, steady, resonant, impossible to ignore. She watched the last traces of mist lift from the hedgerows and wondered whether her life had already changed more than she dared acknowledge. The Duke's determination to dissolve her arranged marriage had settled into her heart with a quiet but profound weight. She feared the hope blooming within her, yet she could not uproot it. The Duke found her in the garden a short while later, his presence as composed as ever despite the fatigue still shadowing his expression. He approached without haste, as though mindful of preserving the fragile calm that surrounded her. "You rise early," he remarked gently. "I feared the unrest in London would follow me home in more ways than one." She offered a faint smile. "Sleep eluded me," she admitted. "Much depends on matters beyond my control." He regarded her with a thoughtful solemnity. "Not entirely beyond your control," he corrected softly. "Your courage set these events in motion." He led her along the gravel path, their footsteps merging with the muted rustle of the morning breeze. Once they reached a secluded alcove bordered by climbing roses. He paused, as though weighing the import of what he must say. "I have received word," he began, "that the Crown's Council has accepted evidence of coercion in your proposed union. It will not be a swift process, but it is now in motion." Relief washed through her like a warm current, but apprehension followed quickly behind. "And Rookwood?" she asked, her voice taut. The Duke's jaw tightened. "He has lost several allies. Your guardians claim they acted only under financial strain, but their involvement is being reviewed. Their pursuit of you has been deemed excessive." Eliza exhaled, a mixture of sorrow and liberation stirring within her. She had not wished disgrace upon her guardians, but she could no longer shield those who had not shielded her. The Duke studied her carefully, perhaps sensing the conflict etched across her features. "You are not responsible for the choices of others," he said. "You sought safety, not vengeance." She nodded, though the words did little to ease the ache of betrayal. They continued walking until they reached the Manor's eastern wing, where warm sunlight spilled through high mullioned windows. Before entering, the Duke paused once more. "There is another matter," he said. "One that concerns not your past, but your future." Inside the drawing-room, morning light illuminated every detail: the faint shimmer of silk curtains, the polished curve of a rosewood pianoforte, the intricate embroidery on the settee. Eliza had always found the room soothing, but now it felt charged with expectation. The Duke gestured for her to sit, then remained standing, hands clasped behind his back in a posture both dignified and vulnerable. "Once your marriage contract is annulled," he began, "you will have choices available to you. Yet all choices bear weight." She watched him closely, sensing the shift in his tone. "I do not know what future you envision for yourself," he said, "but I would have you know that my loyalty does not end when your freedom is secured." Her heart faltered, caught between astonishment and an emotion too delicate to name. "I am grateful beyond measure," she said softly, "but I do not wish to be a burden you feel honor-bound to carry." His expression flickered, surprise tempered by something deeper. "Eliza," he said, abandoning the careful distance of formality, "you are not a burden. If anything, you have reminded me that duty and compassion need not be adversaries." Her breath tightened. "Then what is it you wish for?" she asked. For a long moment, he did not answer. The silence stretched, charged and fragile. At last he stepped closer, his voice lowering to a tone she had heard only once before, late at night by the library fire. "I wish," he said, "for the right to stand beside you without pretense. Not as your protector, nor as the man who intervened in your circumstances, but as someone who has come to admire your strength, your temperance, and your truth." She felt the words settle into her like a warmth that threatened to unmoor her composure. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I do not know whether I deserve such regard." "You deserve far more than regard," he replied. "But I would not presume upon your trust. You have lived under the demands of others long enough. Whatever affection exists between us must be freely chosen." His restraint, so earnest, so unwavering, pierced her more deeply than any declaration could. She rose, hands trembling. "I do not know whether my heart fully understands itself yet," she confessed. "These weeks have been filled with fear and revelations I never expected." He waited, silent but attentive, his gaze steady. "But I do know this," she continued. "When I imagine the life I nearly surrendered myself to, I feel only dread. When I imagine stepping into uncertainty alone, I feel trepidation. Yet when I imagine facing whatever comes next with you, standing beside you, I feel peace." Slowly, as though ensuring she had every chance to withdraw, he reached out and took her hand. The gesture was simple, yet the gravity within it sent a tremor through her. "Then allow me to ask you plainly," he said. "When the shadow of your former engagement has at last dissolved, will you choose to remain at Ashmore? Not as my charge, but as the woman I cherish." A tear traced down her cheek, born of relief more than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "I would choose that." His fingers tightened around hers, reverent rather than possessive. "Then when propriety allows," he said, "I shall ask for your hand not as a claim, but as a promise." She nodded, unable to speak as emotion swelled within her. They stood together in the golden quiet of the drawing-room, two lives no longer bound by fear but drawn forward by a shared resolve. Outside, the rain clouds had finally drifted north, leaving the sky unbroken and blue. And for the first time since fleeing London, Eliza felt as though the world itself had shifted, opening, widening, granting her not a single path but many. The Duke remained beside her, his presence steady as the horizon. Whatever trials awaited them, they would meet them not as strangers united by circumstance, but as two hearts choosing the same future.